Hi everyone, this is Trace here, the humorous tutor. We are continuing to get ahead of the game and sculpting our knowledge, and in this video, this is part 3 of the osteology of the skull. So first, envision if we section this skull on the transverse plane and we were to look down on it from above, so removing the roof of the skull or the calvaria and then, having a look from a superior view down onto the cranial floor. And we've got anterior facing the top of the screen there. And first of all, what's really cool from this view is the ethmoid. And so we can see from this view the crista galli, that was the coxcomb. We can see portions of the cribriform plate. And within the cribriform plate, all of those little holes, they're called the olfactory foramina, through which the olfactory nerves pass through to enter the brain. Now, posteriorly to the ethmoid bone, and I'll see if I can outline it in a decent manner in green here, we have the sphenoid. And so from this view, it's really nice to see that butterfly shape of the sphenoid here. And in dark green, we've outlined the lesser wings of the sphenoid bone, and in light green especially, in dark green again, but now shaded in, we can see the greater wings of the sphenoid. And the body of the sphenoid bone, just posterior and inferior to the lesser wings, we'll find the Cela Turcica, which is the bony saddle for the pituitary gland. Now in orange here from this view, we can see the squamous and the petrous portions of the temporal bone, and so the temporals on either side, like so, and we can also see in, let's do pink, superior to the temporal bone, so it's actually been cut through here, but we can see the remaining portion, the inferior portion there of the parietal bones, and really nice and clearly we can see here the inner surface of the occipital bone, which was the kind of forming that base, the posterior base of that skull here. And very, very notably, we see that gigantic great hole, the Foramen Magnum, literally Latin for hole and great, so the largest hole in the cranium, through which the brainstem will pass through and continue on as the spinal cord. You'll also note that in this view we can see quite a few holes on the cranial floor, and the cranial foramen there, or the cranial foramina, sorry, will be covered in a separate video. And so in this next view, imagine that we remove the mandible, the lower jawbone, and we looked at the underside of the skull here. Again, we see the foramen magnum, but this time we're viewing it from the external kind of aspect, and kind of lateral to either side of the foramen magnum, we see the occipital condyles. Remember that our condyles were those smooth, rounded surfaces, and those condyles are going to sit on C1 to form that atlanto-occipital joint there. On the occipital bone as well, which is quite cool here, we see the inferior and superior nuchal lines, and they're going to form regions of attachments for quite a few important muscles, and that was on the posterior portion. And also kind of a little bit more just behind there, behind the condyles, or posterior to the condyles, we find the condylar canals, but we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a future video. And directly anterior to the foramen magnum on the midline there, we see a small rounded bump, and that's called the pharyngeal tubercle, to which some of the pharyngeal muscles will insert. Now, getting rid of that, let's have a look at this inferior view of the temporal bone from the base of the skull. We can see the sharp, slender styloid process there. Anterior to the styloid process, that indent where the mandibular condyle will fit is the mandibular fossa, and posterior to the styloid process, a little bit more lateral. Remember, we had that mastoid process as well. And just behind the mastoid process, we see a small hole in the mastoid region, and that's the mastoid foramen. And I'll just label it on the other side because it's getting a bit crowded. A little bit anterior to the mastoid process, we find the external acoustic meatus. Now, looking a little bit more anteriorly, on the same view of the skull, we can see we are looking at the inferior view of the hard palate, of which I've circled around one of the bones, and that is the maxilla. We can see that maxilla forming the anterior portion of the hard palate there. Also, just peeking through in this view, we can see the infraorbital foramen. Remember that little hole that just sits underneath the orbit on the maxilla there. And so, posterior to the maxilla, forming the posterior hard palate, we have the palatine bone, and so those two holes there make sense. One's bigger, one's smaller. We have the greater and the lesser. Which bone is it on? The palatine. What is it? A hole. And so we have the greater and lesser palatine foramina there. And of course, just outlining the palatine bone itself on the left there. We can see a little bit of an indent that I'm kind of shading in now, and that's along the median suture of the palatine processes of the maxilla, and we call that the incisive fossa. Incisive referring to the incisors, which are our front teeth, and that's that indent there. So there you go, we found our incisive fossa. And what I thought was cool to appreciate on this view of the skull was the sphenoid bone, which I'm doing a subpar job of outlining there on the base of the skull. Again, on this view we can see quite a few foramina, which we'll go through in a future video, and hopefully that helped to again put together some of these locations in our heads. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.